I've recently noticed that for as much time as I spend talking about, thinking about, and actually playing games, there are quite a few classics and critically acclaimed masterpieces that I have not played. I'm not as familiar with certain genres as I would like, stuff like RPGs, platformers, both 2D and 3D, and third-person action games and the like. I have decent experience with third-person shooters and action-adventure games, but my bread and butter has definitely been first-person shooters. I grew up on Halo, and even during lulls in my game consumption, I still played Call of Duty and Far Cry games all throughout my teenage years. Nowadays, I've played Doom, Wolfenstein, Bioshock, Titanfall 2, and many others, and have an even better grasp on what makes FPS games fun. Through all that, there is still plenty I haven't gotten around to. Quake and Fear are still on my list to get to, as well as some others like Bulletstorm. One of my New Year's resolutions this year was to experience more. Spend less time grinding battle passes or mindlessly playing multiplayer games for hours at a time, and instead focus on gathering more knowledge and experience within my preferred medium, as well as others like books, movies, and anime. If I want to be a better critic, I need to have more examples of fantastic game design to pull from. That's why at the beginning of this year, I ran through both Half-Life and Half-Life 2. I at first kinda hated Half-Life because it's a game with slippery movement that, while works wonders for its fast-paced combat, often caused intense frustration when it asked me to platform. I tried and gave up on Half-Life twice last year before finally pushing through this January. Once I got over the problems I had with the platforming, I saw the game for what it was. Half-Life is a great game and has a lot that other developers can learn from, such as a continuous story that never leaves the main character's eyes and is told almost entirely through the environment. In many ways, the original Half-Life is the better game between these two titans, but Half-Life 2 is more interesting from a game design perspective. Half-Life 2 does things that every video game should do, rather than just FPS games. In game design, introducing variety is extremely important. No game can do one thing for 10 hours and expect the game to be fun. As much as I rag on the Call of Duty franchise, I still enjoy the games and play almost every new release. A mission like Clean House from the new Modern Warfare game is not only great because of its relation to actual Modern Warfare, something that Call of Duty does very well, but because it breaks up the pace and offers something unique to the rest of the game. How variety is introduced can be done in many ways, but to boil it down a bit, it usually ends up in two categories. Games that introduce situational and environmental focused variety, and games that craft their core gameplay to be as varied as possible. The latter half is usually how I prefer my games to be designed. Two of my favorite shooters, hell, two of my favorite games of all time, are Halo and Doom. Games that do have some variety from level to level in terms of situational gameplay, but mostly fold the complexity into their core gameplay. Doom and Halo have enemies that bring different aspects to the combat, and weapons that have unique firing modes and damage types. Mixing and matching enemies and weapons available can make millions of unique variations that appear to be the same, but to the player feels varied and fresh room after room. On the other side of this equation, we have games that vary themselves by introducing situational variety. This is games like Call of Duty and Titanfall 2. In Call of Duty 4, they move you from stealth missions with the SAS to more traditional warfare as the Americans in the Middle East to AC-130 gunships. The game is moving you from one thing to the next, and then cycling those missions to make each feel unique in tone, context, and gameplay from the last. This is the side that Half-Life 1 and 2 fall into. Half-Life 2 goes from corridor shooting in canals to an airboat sequence to Ravenholm and on and on. It does a good job of moving the player along unique experiences while keeping the continuous flowing story from the original Half-Life. Alone, this would be enough to solidify Half-Life 2 as a classic, but it doesn't stop there, as Half-Life 2 overtakes its predecessor in a key way. What Half-Life 2 does better than any game I've ever played is recontextualize its game mechanics in new ways. A very simple example of this would be the airboat sequence. This is often considered to be the most lackluster stage in the entire game, and I am inclined to agree. However, it does give a glimpse of what Half-Life 2 does best. The player is given an airboat and drives their way through the canals of City 17. The airboat sequence at first is about driving and solving physics puzzles along the way. Then, near the end of the first half, it introduces a helicopter that shoots and drops bombs, creating a more dynamic obstacle to mix up the driving. Once reaching some resistance members, it may appear that the section is over, but it's got one more variation to run through. The final stretch involves placing a turret onto the airboat. allowing the player to take the fight to the aforementioned helicopter. It takes the canals and fills them with enemies and obstacles. The act of driving around the airboat and occasionally getting out to solve a problem has had its context change from a focus on the environment to a focus on combat. This is the aspect that makes Half-Life 2 one of the best games ever made. Most games would have been content after the first rather dull section of the airboat sequence, or would have restricted the turret to the player and let an AI drive. Valve was instead keen to both add and iterate on the original idea. Even this airboat sequence, which as I said before is often considered the worst in the game, benefits from the overall design philosophy implemented throughout Half-Life 2. In some of Half-Life 2's more impressive set pieces, this design principle pays dividends. My personal favorite being the use of antlions throughout the game. These buggers are introduced during the beginning of Highway 17. The buggy section operates similar to the second half of the airboat section and allows the player to engage with the antlions from a safer position than being on foot. The player has time to recognize them as melee-focused enemies that are extremely aggressive. We can even see them fighting the Combine. Then, later on, the player is presented with a sandy ravine with two other humans, one laying bloodied in the sand and another on a rock. The man on the rock explains that the antlions will attack if steps are taken on the sand, and then this is shown to the player by the bloodied man making too much movement and 4 antlions attacking him. The player is informed to stay on the rocks, and now the entire beach sandy area becomes a jumping puzzle. As the player jumps between rocks, they come to a point where the next rock is too far away, and now the player has to use pieces of the environment to create a path towards the next rock. The antlions in this situation have been turned from a traditional enemy into a punishment for poor platforming and use of objects in the environment. The player, through skilled use of Half-Life 2's mechanics, could entirely avoid the antlions in this section, but most players will trigger punishment at least once. After the player reaches safety, they are given bug bait, which again changes the context surrounding the antlions. Now the antlions have gone from little buggers to little cuties as they follow the player around and can be directed by throwing the bug bait. These enemies have now transformed into a punishment and then into a tool at the player's disposal. Now the player can send these antlions to attack specific targets, and a few will always respawn to ensure they are always available for the player. They can be used to attack on higher platforms or act as distractions while the player gets an angle on a room of Combine. The evolution of antlions and their role in the game is something that I feel more developers should take note of, especially if they intend to weave variety into the levels and enemies rather than the pure combat. Half-Life 2 constantly asks the player to pay attention to their environment, sometimes to solve a physics puzzle, other times to find the correct path to an objective. Right from the first section of gameplay, does the game ask the player to use pieces of the environment to get past barnacles. Then the player is given the gravity gun and can use it to move larger objects by either blasting them or picking them up. The player is then sent to Ravenholm, that completely changes the tone to something unique, but also gives the player a clear opportunity to use the gravity gun as an offensive tool by placing a plentiful supply of saw blades around the environment. Then, when the player enters the antlion sands, they are required to use the gravity gun to create their own path through the dangerous sand. Throughout the game, the gravity gun can also be used to pull supply crates to the player. Then, at the end of the game, the gravity gun becomes a true power weapon, as Combine are blown away or pulled in only to be thrown back at their allies. The gravity gun goes through multiple changes that recontextualize the way the player is intended to use it. But the real star of the show here is that environment. Obstacles become ammunition, and tools become power weapons. While most shooters with hit-scan weapons are better off with using regenerating health and health packs, Half-Life 2 is certainly an exception, as needing to search for health stations and health pickups reinforces the idea of scavenging and using the environment to the player's advantage. This is also reflected in the storytelling, which is mostly done through the environment. While I felt the original Half-Life did a better job of environmental storytelling, and as well as not locking the player in a room with NPCs for minutes at a time, Half-Life 2 does still excel in this area. Paying attention to the surroundings is a core principle in both the gameplay and story of Half-Life 2. Half-Life 2 is a fantastic example of great game design. It spends less time creating all new assets by reusing and recontextualizing previous ones. It would have been just as logical for Valve to make a new character or robot for the player to control, but I imagine the idea to reuse antlines went a long way in terms of saving time on development, as well as fulfill a player fantasy of controlling a once dangerous enemy. It cleverly weaves variety into its game and feels a lot more cohesive than something like Call of Duty, that will plop you in an AC-130 for a level, only then to fade to black and plop you in Chernobyl with a sniper. Not to say that Call of Duty 4 has bad game design, just to say that the sense of immersion is much stronger in Half-Life 2, as the player moves continuously through the world, and getting to new areas is done with the context of actually traveling there in a vehicle. Half-Life 2 is a fantastic game to add to my collective memory, and I am so glad I played it.
Don't you think it's bad?